Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. But first, let me give you some context about just how insane these journeys really were. Vikings didn't just sail around their local fjords for a few hours. These madmen crossed entire oceans in boats that were essentially oversized canoes. They sailed from Scandinavia to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, covering thousands of miles in vessels that modern sailors wouldn't trust to cross a lake. And they did this without GPS, without weather forecasting, without any of the safety equipment we consider essential today. The average Viking longship was about 60 to 70 feet long and 15 feet wide. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than most modern recreational boats. Yet they crammed 30 to 60 people into that tiny space for journeys that could last weeks or even months. Imagine being trapped in a space the size of a small apartment with 60 other people, with no privacy, no comfort, and no escape. These ships were designed for one thing: speed and maneuverability in battle. They were not designed for comfort or long-term habitation. The hull was shallow, which made them incredibly fast, but also meant they were constantly at the mercy of waves and weather. There was no shelter except for a small tent-like structure that might protect a few people, and most of the crew was completely exposed to the elements. Now you might be thinking, surely these tough Viking warriors could handle a little discomfort, right? Well, you're about to discover that what they endured goes far beyond discomfort. We're talking about conditions so harsh that they would break most modern people within days. Let's start with the most basic human need: space to exist. On a Viking longship, personal space was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Each man had roughly 6 feet of space to call his own, and this wasn't just his sleeping area. This was his entire world for the duration of the voyage. He would eat, sleep, work, and relieve himself within this tiny allocated space. The sleeping arrangements were particularly brutal. There were no beds, no mattresses, no pillows. Vikings slept on the hard wooden deck, maybe with a thin piece of cloth or animal hide if they were lucky. During storms, they couldn't even lie down properly because they needed to constantly bail water or adjust the sail. Many Vikings would sleep sitting up, leaning against their sea chest or the side of the boat, trying to find any position that would give them a few hours of rest. But even when they could lie down, sleep was often impossible. The constant motion of the boat, the noise of creaking wood and crashing waves, and the proximity of so many other people made rest a rare luxury. Add to this the fact that someone always needed to be on watch, steering the ship or looking out for dangers, and you start to understand why Vikings often arrived at their destinations already exhausted before any fighting even began. The lack of privacy was psychologically devastating. Imagine trying to maintain any sense of dignity or personal space when you're surrounded by dozens of other men 24 hours a day for weeks on end. There was nowhere to go for a moment of solitude, nowhere to escape the constant presence of others. This psychological pressure alone was enough to drive some men to madness, but the cramped conditions were just the beginning of their problems. The smell inside a Viking longship was absolutely revolting. With 30 to 60 unwashed men confined in a small space, the stench was overwhelming. These weren't people who bathed regularly even on land, and on a ship. There was virtually no opportunity for personal hygiene. Vikings would go weeks without changing their clothes or washing their bodies. Their woolen leather garments would become soaked with seawater, sweat, and worse, then never properly dry. The combination of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and poor ventilation created a smell so powerful that it could be detected from miles away. Enemy ships could literally smell a Viking longship approaching before they could see it. The situation with human waste was particularly horrific. There were no toilets, no privacy, and no proper sanitation. Vikings had to relieve themselves over the side of the boat, which was dangerous during storms and impossible during rough weather. During bad weather, they had no choice but to use buckets or designated areas of the ship, which would then need to be cleaned out when conditions improved. The smell of human waste mixed with the already overwhelming body odor created an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Many Vikings would tie cloth around their faces to try to filter the air, but there was no escaping the stench. New crew members would often spend their first days constantly vomiting, not just from seasickness but from the overwhelming smell. Food storage added another layer to this olfactory nightmare. Vikings carried salted meat, dried fish, and other preserved foods that had their own strong odors. These foods would often spoil during long voyages, adding the smell of rotting meat to the already toxic atmosphere. The combination of all these odors created a miasma so thick and nauseating that it's hard for modern people to even imagine. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the smell was how it clung to everything. Vikings' clothes, hair, skin, and equipment would absorb these odors so completely that they would carry the stench with them long after leaving the ship. Even after returning to land and bathing, the smell would linger for weeks. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. The constant assault on the senses, combined with the physical discomfort and lack of privacy, created a level of stress that pushed many Vikings to their breaking point. Fights would break out over the smallest issues. Friendships would be destroyed, and the social bonds that held Viking society together would be tested to their limits. Yet somehow, these men endured. They found ways to cope with conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. They developed techniques for sleeping in impossible positions, methods for maintaining some semblance of hygiene, and mental strategies for dealing with the psychological pressure of their floating prison. The Vikings who survived these voyages were forever changed by the experience. They returned home hardened not just by battle, but by the brutal ordeal of simply surviving the journey itself. The Longship voyage was like a crucible that forged ordinary men into the legendary warriors we remember today. But the cramped, stinking conditions were just one aspect of the nightmare. The daily routine aboard a Viking longship was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Every single day was a battle against exhaustion, and there was no rest for anyone. The most grueling aspect of daily life was rowing. Viking longships were powered primarily by human muscle, and when the wind wasn't favorable, every able-bodied man had to take his turn at the oars. These weren't the lightweight oars you might find on a recreational boat. Viking oars were massive, heavy pieces of wood that required tremendous strength to operate effectively. A typical rowing shift lasted between 4 to 6 hours, and during this time, the rowers had to maintain a steady, powerful rhythm. The work was so intense that men's hands would blister and bleed within the first few days of a voyage. The constant friction from gripping the rough wooden oar handles would tear away skin, leaving raw, open wounds that would never properly heal during the journey. The physical demands were extraordinary. Rowing required not just arm strength, but the coordinated effort of the entire body. Vikings had to engage their legs, core, back, and arms in perfect synchronization, all while maintaining the precise timing necessary to keep the ship moving efficiently. A single rower falling out of rhythm could throw off the entire crew and slow the ship's progress. But the rowing was just the beginning of their daily labor. During storms or rough weather, every man on board became part of the crew responsible for keeping the ship afloat. This meant constantly bailing water that crashed over the sides or leaked through the hull. Viking longships were not watertight vessels. They were designed for speed and flexibility, which meant they constantly took on water during rough seas. Bailing water was a never-ending task that required Vikings to use buckets, bowls, or even their helmets to scoop water out of the ship and throw it overboard. During severe storms, this became a matter of life and death. If the crew couldn't bail water fast enough, the ship would sink, taking everyone down with it. Men would work for hours without rest, their arms burning with exhaustion, knowing that stopping meant death for everyone on board. The sail management was another brutal aspect of daily life that demanded constant attention and incredible physical strength. Viking sails were enormous pieces of wool cloth that could weigh hundreds of pounds when wet. Raising, lowering, and adjusting these massive sails required the coordinated effort of multiple men working in perfect harmony. When the wind changed direction, which happened frequently during ocean voyages, the entire crew had to spring into action to adjust the sail. This wasn't a simple matter of pulling a rope. The sail had to be completely repositioned, which meant untying heavy ropes, hauling the massive sail to a new position, and then securing it again with knots that could withstand hurricane-force winds. During storms, managing the sail became a life-or-death struggle. Vikings had to work on a pitching, rolling deck that was constantly being swept by waves, trying to control a sail that was being whipped around by winds strong enough to knock a man overboard. Many Vikings were injured or killed during these sail operations, either by being struck by the heavy wooden boom or by being swept overboard while trying to secure loose rigging. The physical toll of these daily tasks was devastating. Within days of beginning a voyage, every Viking's body would be screaming in pain. Their hands would be raw and bleeding from rope burns and splinters. Their backs would ache from the constant bending and lifting. Their arms and shoulders would burn with a pain that never went away, no matter how much rest they managed to get. But rest was a luxury that rarely came. Even when a Viking wasn't actively rowing or working the sail, there were dozens of other tasks that needed constant attention. The ship's hull had to be inspected regularly for damage. Loose boards had to be resecured. Equipment had to be maintained and repaired. Food and water supplies had to be managed and distributed. Navigation was another constant concern that required the attention of the most experienced crew members. Vikings navigated using the position of the sun and stars, the behavior of birds, the color and temperature of the water, and their knowledge of ocean currents. This required constant observation and calculation, with no room for error. A mistake in navigation could mean sailing into a storm, running aground on hidden rocks, or becoming completely lost in the vast ocean. The psychological pressure of this constant work was enormous. There was no 8-hour workday, no weekends, no vacation time. Every moment of every day required vigilance and effort. Vikings had to maintain this level of intensity for weeks or even months, knowing that any lapse in attention or effort could result in disaster for the entire crew. The watch system added another layer of exhaustion to their already brutal routine. Someone always had to be awake and alert, watching for dangers, monitoring the weather, and steering the ship. This meant that sleep was broken into short, interrupted periods. A Viking might get 3 or 4 hours of rest, only to be woken up for his watch duty, then have to row for 6 hours, then maybe get another hour or 2 of sleep before being called to adjust the sail. This constant sleep deprivation had serious effects on both physical and mental health. Vikings would become clumsy and accident-prone, making mistakes that could endanger the entire crew. They would become irritable and prone to violent outbursts over minor disagreements. Some would begin to hallucinate from exhaustion, seeing things that weren't there, or hearing voices in the wind and waves. The food situation made everything worse. Vikings carried preserved foods that were designed to last for long voyages, but these were hardly appetizing or nutritious. Their diet consisted mainly of dried fish, salted meat, hard biscuits, and ale or water. Fresh food was impossible to preserve for long periods, so Vikings would go weeks without eating anything that wasn't dried, salted, or fermented. The dried fish was particularly unpleasant. It was hard as a rock and had to be soaked in water or ale to make it edible. Even then, it was tough, salty, and often infested with insects or maggots. The salted meat wasn't much better, often becoming rancid during long voyages and developing a taste that would make most modern people vomit. Water was always a critical concern. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed, and it often became stagnant and foul-tasting during long voyages. Vikings would sometimes resort to drinking seawater mixed with ale, which would make them sick, but was better than dying of thirst. The lack of fresh water also meant that cooking was limited, so most food was eaten cold and unappetizing. The limited diet led to serious nutritional deficiencies. Vikings would develop scurvy from lack of vitamin C, causing their teeth to fall out and their gums to bleed. They would suffer from various other deficiency diseases that would weaken their immune systems and make them susceptible to infections and illnesses. Mealtimes provided no relief from the harsh conditions. Vikings ate while sitting on the hard deck, often in rough weather with waves crashing over the sides. Food would be contaminated with salt water, and eating became more about survival than any kind of pleasure. Many Vikings would lose significant weight during long voyages, arriving at their destinations gaunt and weakened. The psychological impact of this poor nutrition combined with the physical exhaustion created a perfect storm of misery. Hungry, tired men, trapped in a small space with no privacy and no comfort, became increasingly volatile and unpredictable. The legendary Viking berserkers may have been as much a product of these brutal conditions as they were of any warrior culture. Yet through all of this daily torture, Vikings had to maintain their equipment and weapons. Their lives depended on keeping their axes, swords, and shields in perfect condition. But the salt water and constant moisture made this nearly impossible. Metal would rust within days, if not constantly maintained. Leather would rot and fall apart. Wood would warp and crack. Vikings spent what little free time they had trying to preserve their gear, rubbing oil into leather, sharpening blades, and replacing broken handles. This maintenance was crucial because they knew that when they reached their destination, they would likely have to fight, and their survival would depend on having functional weapons and armor. The constant threat of equipment failure added another layer of stress to their already overwhelming daily routine. A broken oar could slow the entire ship. A torn sail could leave them stranded in the middle of the ocean. A damaged hull could sink the ship and kill everyone on board. Every piece of equipment had to be constantly monitored and maintained, adding to the endless list of tasks that had to be completed every single day. This constant maintenance became a matter of life and death because equipment failure in the middle of the ocean meant certain doom. Vikings developed an almost obsessive relationship with their tools and weapons, checking them multiple times per day, because they understood that their survival depended entirely on these pieces of wood, metal, and leather functioning perfectly when needed most. But perhaps nothing was more terrifying than the weather itself, which could transform their already miserable existence into a genuine fight for survival in a matter of minutes. Viking longships were at the complete mercy of nature's fury, and when storms hit, these vessels became floating coffins where death lurked around every crashing wave. The North Atlantic is one of the most treacherous bodies of water on Earth, known for sudden, violent storms that can appear without warning. Modern ships with steel hulls, advanced weather prediction, and sophisticated navigation systems still struggle with these waters. Vikings faced them in wooden boats with nothing but their experience and raw determination. When a storm began brewing, the atmosphere on board would change dramatically. Experienced Vikings could read the signs in the color of the water, the behavior of seabirds, and the feel of the wind. They knew that their lives were about to be put to the ultimate test, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to avoid what was coming. The first sign of an approaching storm was usually a change in the waves. What had been relatively calm seas would begin to show whitecaps and longer swells. The wind would shift direction and pick up strength. The air itself would feel different, charged with an electricity that made every Viking's skin crawl with anticipation of the horror to come. As the storm intensified, waves that had been manageable would grow into towering walls of water that dwarfed their tiny vessel. These weren't the gentle rolling waves you might see at a beach. These were massive, angry mountains of water that could reach heights of 30, 40, or even 50 feet. To put that in perspective, imagine standing next to a 5-story building. Then imagine that building, made of water, crashing down on top of you. The Longship would be tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. One moment, the crew would be looking up at a wall of water so high they couldn't see the top. The next moment, they would be sliding down the back of a wave into a trough so deep that the storm clouds seemed to disappear above them. The sensation was like being inside a washing machine operated by an angry god. During these storms, every single person on board had to fight for their lives. There was no safe place to hide, no shelter that could protect them from the fury of the ocean. Waves would crash over the sides of the ship with such force that they could knock a grown man unconscious or sweep him overboard to his death. Vikings had to lash themselves to the ship with ropes to avoid being thrown into the churning sea. The noise during a storm was absolutely deafening. The wind would howl like a living thing, creating a sound so loud that Vikings couldn't hear each other shouting from just a few feet away. The waves would crash against the hull with the force of thunder, creating booms that could be felt in every bone of their bodies. The ship itself would creak and groan as the wooden hull flexed and twisted under the immense pressure, creating sounds that suggested the vessel was about to break apart at any moment. Water would pour over the sides faster than the crew could bail it out. Vikings would form human chains, passing buckets of water from hand to hand in a desperate attempt to keep the ship afloat. But during the worst storms, they would be fighting a losing battle. Water would accumulate in the bottom of the ship faster than they could remove it, and they would know that they were slowly sinking. The physical demands during a storm were beyond human endurance, yet Vikings had no choice but to endure them anyway. They had to maintain their footing on a deck that was constantly pitching and rolling at impossible angles. They had to work with equipment that was slippery with seawater and nearly impossible to grip. They had to perform complex tasks while being battered by winds strong enough to knock them down and waves powerful enough to break their bones. Many Vikings were seriously injured during storms. They would be thrown against the sides of the ship, breaking ribs and arms. They would be struck by loose equipment that became deadly projectiles in the chaos. Some would be partially swept overboard, saved only by the ropes that bound them to the ship, but left with injuries that would never properly heal. The psychological terror of these storms was perhaps even worse than the physical danger. Vikings were brave warriors who feared little in battle, but storms reduced them to helpless children at the mercy of forces beyond their comprehension or control. They would pray to their gods, make bargains with the spirits of the sea, and prepare themselves for death while continuing to fight for survival. The darkness during night storms was particularly horrifying. Vikings would be surrounded by a blackness so complete that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They would hear the roar of approaching waves but have no idea which direction they were coming from or how large they were. The ship would suddenly lurch violently, and they would know that another massive wave had hit them, but they couldn't see what was happening or prepare for the next impact. Lightning during storms created moments of stark, terrifying clarity. For brief instants, the entire scene would be illuminated in harsh white light, revealing the true magnitude of the waves surrounding them and the desperate faces of their companions. Then, the darkness would return, leaving them blind once again, but with the horrible knowledge of just how close to death they really were. Some storms would last for days, testing human endurance beyond any reasonable limit. Vikings would go without sleep, without food, without rest, battling constantly just to keep their ship afloat. They would work until their bodies gave out, then somehow find the strength to continue working. Men would collapse from exhaustion, only to be revived by a wave crashing over them, forcing them back into the fight for survival. The cold during storms made everything exponentially worse. The North Atlantic is frigid even during summer, and storm winds would drive the temperature down to levels that could kill through hypothermia. Vikings would be soaked to the skin with ice-cold seawater, with no way to get warm or dry. Their clothes would freeze to their bodies, and their hands would become so numb that they could barely grip the ropes and tools they needed to survive. Frostbite was a constant danger during winter storms. Vikings would lose fingers and toes to the cold, and some would die from hypothermia even if the ship survived the storm. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and terror would push many men beyond their breaking point, and some would simply give up, accepting death rather than continuing to fight against impossible odds. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of storms was the complete helplessness they imposed. Vikings were proud, independent warriors who were accustomed to controlling their own destiny through strength and skill. Storms stripped all of that away, reducing them to frightened passengers on a vessel that was completely at the mercy of natural forces they couldn't understand or influence. During the worst storms, Vikings would genuinely believe they were going to die. They would say goodbye to each other, share their final thoughts, and prepare to meet their gods. The fact that they often survived these experiences only added to their reputation as warriors touched by divine favor. But the psychological scars of these near-death experiences would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When storms finally passed, the aftermath was often almost as brutal as the storm itself. The ship would be damaged, with broken oars, torn sails, and loose planking that needed immediate repair. Equipment would be lost or damaged beyond use. Some crew members would be injured or, in the worst cases, missing entirely, swept overboard during the chaos. The exhaustion following a major storm was unlike anything most people have ever experienced. Vikings would have been fighting for their lives for hours or days without rest, food, or water. Their bodies would be battered and bruised, their hands torn and bleeding, their muscles screaming with fatigue. Yet they would still have to continue sailing, often with damaged equipment and reduced crew, because stopping in the middle of the ocean meant certain death. Recovery from storms could take days or weeks, assuming the ship and crew survived intact. Vikings would have to jury-rig repairs using whatever materials they had on board. They would have to redistribute duties to account for injured or missing crew members. They would have to ration their remaining supplies more carefully if stores had been lost or contaminated during the storm. The psychological impact of surviving these storms was profound. Vikings who lived through multiple severe storms developed a fatalistic attitude toward life and death that influenced their entire worldview. They understood viscerally that death could come at any moment, without warning, and that survival often depended more on luck than on skill or courage. This constant exposure to mortal danger created the legendary Viking fearlessness in battle. Men who had faced down storms that could sink mountains were not easily intimidated by human enemies. They had already looked death in the face multiple times and survived, giving them a confidence and recklessness that made them formidable warriors. Yet the weather wasn't just dangerous during storms. Even calm weather presented its own unique challenges that could slowly kill Vikings through exposure, dehydration, and despair. Becalmed ships could drift for weeks without wind, leaving crews stranded in the middle of the ocean with dwindling supplies and no way to reach land. During these calm periods, the sun would beat down mercilessly on Vikings who had no shelter from its rays. The wooden deck would become so hot that it burned their feet through their boots. The lack of wind meant no relief from the stifling heat, and dehydration became a serious threat. Vikings would ration their water so carefully that they were constantly thirsty, their lips cracked and bleeding, their throats parched and painful. The psychological torture of being becalmed was arguably worse than storms. During storms, Vikings could at least feel like they were fighting for their survival. During calm periods, they could only sit and wait, watching their supplies dwindle while scanning the horizon for any sign of wind or land. The helplessness was maddening, and many Vikings would begin to show signs of mental breakdown after days or weeks of drifting aimlessly. But the weather was just one enemy these Vikings faced on their floating prisons. Disease and injury were constant companions that turned every minor cut into a potential death sentence. Without any medical knowledge beyond basic battlefield treatment, Vikings watched helplessly as their companions died from infections that would be easily treatable today. The cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard Viking longships created the perfect breeding ground for disease. With no understanding of germs or hygiene, Vikings unknowingly created environments where deadly illnesses could spread like wildfire through the entire crew. A single sick person could infect everyone on board within days, turning the ship into a floating plague vessel. Dysentery was one of the most common and deadly diseases that plagued Viking voyages. The combination of contaminated food, polluted water, and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for this devastating illness. Vikings would suffer from severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, quickly becoming too weak to perform their duties. In the confined space of a longship, the disease would spread rapidly from person to person. The symptoms of dysentery were particularly brutal in the context of shipboard life. Vikings suffering from the disease would lose control of their bowels, creating an even more horrific sanitary situation than already existed. The smell would become unbearable, and healthy crew members would be forced to clean up after their sick companions while trying not to become infected themselves. Dehydration from dysentery was often fatal because Vikings had limited fresh water supplies that couldn't be wasted on trying to keep sick men hydrated. Crew members would watch their friends waste away, becoming skeletal shadows of their former selves before finally dying in agony. The bodies would have to be thrown overboard, often while still barely alive, because there was no way to properly care for the dying in such conditions. Scurvy was another constant threat that slowly destroyed Vikings from the inside out. This disease, caused by lack of vitamin C, would begin with seemingly minor symptoms like fatigue and joint pain. But as voyages stretched on for weeks or months, the effects became increasingly horrific. Vikings' teeth would loosen and fall out, their gums would bleed constantly, and old wounds would reopen as their bodies lost the ability to heal properly. The psychological impact of watching your own body deteriorate from scurvy was devastating. Vikings would feel their strength leaving them day by day, knowing that they were slowly dying, but powerless to stop it. Their skin would develop a sickly pallor, and dark spots would appear all over their bodies. Some would become so weak that they couldn't even lift an oar, making them useless dead weight that the crew had to carry. Advanced scurvy would cause internal bleeding that Vikings couldn't understand or treat. They would cough up blood, develop massive bruises from minor bumps, and experience excruciating pain in their joints and muscles. The disease would eventually kill them, but not before weeks or months of progressive suffering that demoralized the entire crew. Infections from minor wounds were perhaps the most frustrating cause of death because they seemed so preventable. A small cut from a splinter or rope burn could become infected in the dirty, wet conditions of the ship. Without antibiotics or proper wound care, these infections would spread through the bloodstream, causing fever, delirium, and eventual death. Vikings would watch in horror as a tiny scratch on a companion's hand would gradually turn red, then black, then begin to smell of rot and decay. The infected area would swell to enormous proportions, filled with pus and dead tissue. Eventually, the infection would spread throughout the body, causing the victim to develop a high fever and begin speaking nonsense before finally dying in agony. Blood poisoning from infected wounds was particularly terrifying because it could kill a strong, healthy Viking within days. The victim would develop red streaks running up their arm or leg from the infected wound, and everyone knew this was a death sentence. There was nothing they could do except watch their companion die, knowing that any of them could be next if they suffered even a minor injury. Broken bones were another serious threat because they almost never healed properly in shipboard conditions. A Viking who broke his arm or leg during a storm would be crippled for life, assuming he survived the voyage at all. Without proper splinting or medical care, bones would heal crooked or not at all, leaving the victim permanently disabled and unable to fight or work effectively. The constant dampness and cold made bone injuries even more problematic. Vikings with broken bones would experience constant pain that intensified during storms or cold weather. Many would develop infections in the broken bone itself, leading to a slow, agonizing death as the infection spread throughout their body. Hypothermia was a constant danger that could kill Vikings even during relatively mild weather. The combination of wet clothes, cold winds, and lack of shelter meant that body temperature could drop to dangerous levels without warning. Vikings suffering from hypothermia would become confused and disoriented, making poor decisions that could endanger the entire crew. The early stages of hypothermia were particularly dangerous because Vikings might not realize what was happening to them. They would begin to shiver uncontrollably, but this was so common in the cold conditions that it didn't seem alarming. As their condition worsened, they would become clumsy and slow, making mistakes that could damage equipment or injure other crew members. Advanced hypothermia would cause Vikings to become irrational and even remove their clothes, thinking they were hot when they were actually freezing to death. This paradoxical undressing was often the last thing a Viking would do before dying, leaving his companions confused and horrified by his apparently senseless behavior. Drowning was an ever-present threat that could claim Vikings even when they were safely aboard the ship. During storms, waves would crash over the sides with such force that they could pin a man underwater even though he was still technically on deck. Vikings who couldn't swim, which was most of them, would panic and thrash around, often making their situation worse. The irony of drowning while aboard a ship was not lost on Vikings, who understood that the ocean could kill them in countless different ways. They developed a healthy respect for the sea that bordered on superstition, creating elaborate rituals and offerings designed to appease the spirits they believed controlled the waters. Many Vikings who fell overboard were never recovered, even if they fell during calm weather. The ship couldn't easily turn around to search for a missing man, and without life preservers or rescue equipment, anyone who went into the water was essentially doomed. Crews would watch helplessly as their companions disappeared beneath the waves, knowing there was nothing they could do to help. The psychological trauma of watching friends die from disease and injury was perhaps as damaging as the physical threats themselves. Vikings were warriors who expected to die in battle with weapons in their hands, earning their place in Valhalla through glorious combat. Dying slowly from disease or drowning in the ocean offered no glory, no honor, and no hope of a warrior's afterlife. This constant exposure to senseless death created a fatalistic attitude among Viking crews that affected every aspect of their behavior. They would make dark jokes about death, develop superstitions about everything from the color of the water to the behavior of seabirds, and form intense bonds with their surviving companions that were forged in shared suffering. The lack of medical knowledge meant that Vikings often tried desperate remedies that were more likely to kill than cure. They would attempt to treat infections by cauterizing wounds with hot metal, often causing more damage than the original injury. They would try to cure scurvy by drinking urine or eating leather, not understanding that these treatments were useless at best and harmful at worst. Some Vikings would resort to amputation when infections threatened to spread, using crude tools and no anesthesia to hack off infected limbs. Most patients died from shock or blood loss during these procedures, but it was considered preferable to certain death from spreading infection. The screams of men undergoing these primitive surgeries would haunt the dreams of everyone aboard. Religious rituals became increasingly important as death stalked the ship. Vikings would make offerings to the sea gods, perform elaborate ceremonies to ward off evil spirits, and pray constantly to their pantheon of deities for protection. These rituals provided some psychological comfort, but did nothing to address the real medical problems that were killing them. The disposal of bodies presented its own challenges and psychological trauma. Dead Vikings had to be thrown overboard immediately to prevent the spread of disease, but this meant that many warriors never received proper burial rites. Their companions would have to watch their friends disappear beneath the waves, knowing they would never be properly honored or remembered. Some Vikings would try to preserve bodies for proper burial once they reached land, but this was usually impossible in the warm, humid conditions of the ship's interior. Bodies would decompose rapidly, creating an unbearable stench and attracting rats and other vermin that would spread disease to the living crew members. The constant presence of death changed Vikings in fundamental ways. Men who survived multiple voyages would develop a hardened indifference to suffering that served them well in battle, but made them seem callous and cruel to outsiders. They learned to compartmentalize their emotions, pushing aside grief and fear to focus on the immediate tasks necessary for survival. Yet despite all these medical horrors, Vikings continued to undertake these voyages, driven by a combination of economic necessity, cultural expectations, and pure stubborn determination. They understood the risks, but considered them acceptable prices to pay for the wealth and glory that successful raids could bring. The survivors of these medical nightmares would return home as changed men, carrying physical scars and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Many would suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt that made it difficult to readjust to normal life on land. But the medical threats were only part of the horror that awaited Vikings on their ocean voyages. The constant threat of starvation loomed over every expedition, turning mealtimes into grim calculations of survival odds, rather than opportunities for nourishment and fellowship. Food management aboard a Viking longship was a matter of life and death that required careful planning and ruthless discipline. Vikings had to carry enough provisions to sustain 30 to 60 men for weeks or months, but storage space was extremely limited and preservation methods were primitive at best. Every pound of food had to be carefully calculated against the available space and the expected duration of the voyage. The staple foods carried on Viking voyages were designed for longevity rather than taste or nutrition. Dried fish formed the backbone of their diet, but this wasn't the carefully prepared dried fish we might buy today. Viking dried fish was often poorly preserved, infested with insects, and so hard that it had to be soaked in water or beaten with hammers before it could be eaten. The process of preparing dried fish for consumption was disgusting and time-consuming. Vikings would have to scrape off mold and maggots, then soak the fish in whatever water they could spare. Even then, the result was often a mushy, foul-tasting substance that bore little resemblance to actual food. Many Vikings would gag while trying to eat it, but the alternative was starvation. Salted meat was another primary food source, but it came with its own problems. The salt used for preservation was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and other impurities that made the meat gritty and unpalatable. The meat itself would often spoil despite the salt, developing a rancid taste that would make modern people violently ill. During long voyages, salted meat would often become so hard that Vikings couldn't bite through it. They would have to use their knives to hack off small pieces, then chew them like leather until they were soft enough to swallow. The constant chewing would leave their jaws aching and their teeth worn down, but it was the only way to get any nutrition from their rations. Hardtack biscuits provided carbohydrates but were notorious for becoming infested with weevils and other insects. Vikings would often have to eat these biscuits in the dark, so they couldn't see the bugs crawling through their food. The biscuits would become so hard during voyages that they could break teeth, forcing Vikings to soak them in ale or water until they softened into a mushy paste. The psychological impact of eating infested food cannot be overstated. Vikings were proud warriors who valued strength and vitality, but they were forced to consume food that was crawling with insects and often partially rotted. This degradation of their most basic needs contributed to a sense of desperation and demoralization that affected the entire crew. Fresh water presented even more serious challenges than food. Vikings had to carry enough water for the entire crew for the duration of the voyage, but water was heavy and took up valuable space that could be used for other supplies. They would store water in wooden barrels or leather containers, but these storage methods led to serious problems with water quality. Water stored in wooden barrels would quickly become stagnant and develop a foul taste that made it barely drinkable. The wood would impart its own flavors to the water, and algae would begin to grow in the dark, warm conditions inside the barrels. After a few weeks, the water would smell like a swamp and taste even worse. Leather water containers presented different problems, but were equally unpalatable. The water would take on the taste of the leather and whatever substances had been used to treat it. It would often become contaminated with bacteria and other microorganisms that would cause illness among the crew. Vikings had no way to purify contaminated water, so they often had to choose between drinking foul water or dying of thirst. Rationing water required brutal discipline that tested the social bonds holding the crew together. Each man would receive a small portion of water each day, barely enough to sustain life. They would have to resist the temptation to drink their entire ration at once, saving some for later in the day when thirst became unbearable. The psychological torture of constant thirst was almost unbearable. Vikings would dream about fresh, clean water, fantasizing about springs and streams they had known on land. Some would become obsessed with water, thinking about it constantly and developing elaborate plans for what they would drink when they finally reached land. During storms, water rationing became even more critical because the physical exertion required to keep the ship afloat would increase everyone's thirst dramatically. Vikings would work for hours bailing water and managing sails while desperately craving the very substance they were trying to keep out of their ship. The irony was not lost on them that they were surrounded by water but couldn't drink any of it. Some desperate Vikings would try to drink seawater, but this would only make their situation worse. Seawater would cause violent illness and actually increase thirst rather than relieving it. Experienced Vikings would have to physically restrain their companions from drinking seawater, knowing that it would kill them faster than thirst alone. The combination of inadequate food and water created a state of chronic malnutrition that weakened Vikings physically and mentally. They would lose significant weight during long voyages, becoming gaunt shadows of their former selves. Their strength would diminish daily, making it increasingly difficult to perform the physical tasks necessary to keep the ship moving and on course. Malnutrition would also affect Vikings' mental capabilities, making them prone to poor judgment and irrational behavior. They would become irritable and quick to anger, leading to fights over food rations or perceived slights. The social structure that held Viking society together would begin to break down under the pressure of starvation. Some Vikings would resort to desperate measures to supplement their rations. They would try to catch fish using improvised hooks and lines, but this was extremely difficult from a moving ship and rarely successful. They would attempt to catch seabirds that landed on the rigging, but these birds were wary and difficult to capture. When Vikings did manage to catch fresh fish or birds, the excitement would be overwhelming. Fresh meat was such a rare treat that it would boost morale throughout the entire crew. However, these small supplements could never provide enough nutrition to significantly improve their overall condition. The discovery of spoiled food in their stores was a disaster that could doom the entire expedition. Vikings would open a barrel of salted meat only to find it completely rotten and inedible. This meant that their carefully calculated food supplies would have to be stretched even further, reducing everyone's rations and increasing the likelihood of starvation. Fights over food became increasingly common as voyages progressed and hunger intensified. Vikings would accuse each other of stealing rations or taking more than their fair share. These accusations could lead to violent confrontations that would split the crew into factions and make cooperation even more difficult. The hierarchy aboard Viking ships would sometimes break down completely when food became scarce. Normally, leaders would eat first and receive the best portions, but desperate hunger could drive even loyal followers to challenge this system. Mutinies over food distribution were not uncommon, leading to bloodshed and chaos aboard ships that were already struggling to survive. Some Viking leaders would try to maintain discipline through increasingly harsh punishments for food theft or hoarding. They would threaten to throw offenders overboard or leave them behind at the next landing. But these threats became less effective as starvation made everyone desperate. The psychological impact of watching companions slowly starve to death was devastating for crew morale. Vikings would see their friends becoming weaker each day, losing weight and strength until they could no longer perform their duties. Eventually, some would simply lie down and refuse to get up, waiting for death to take them. The decision of whether to continue feeding Vikings who were too weak to work created moral dilemmas that tore crews apart. Some argued that food should only go to those who could contribute to the ship's operation, while others insisted that loyalty demanded they care for all crew members, regardless of their condition. When Vikings finally died of starvation, their bodies would be thrown overboard like those who died of disease. But starvation deaths were particularly demoralizing because they seemed so preventable if only they had brought more food or managed their supplies better. Survivors would be haunted by guilt, wondering if they could have done something different to save their companions. The constant hunger would affect every aspect of life aboard the ship. Vikings would become obsessed with food, talking about meals they had eaten in the past and planning elaborate feasts they would have when they returned home. These conversations would provide some psychological relief, but also intensify their current suffering by highlighting what they were missing. Some Vikings would develop eating disorders or food-related compulsions that would persist long after they returned to land. They would hoard food obsessively or eat enormous quantities when it was available, unable to trust that their next meal was secure. The psychological scars of starvation would follow them for the rest of their lives. The irony of dying from starvation while surrounded by the ocean's abundance was not lost on Vikings. They could see fish swimming around their ship and seabirds flying overhead, but they lacked the tools and knowledge to effectively harvest these resources. They were trapped in a desert of plenty, dying of thirst while surrounded by undrinkable water and starving while surrounded by uncatchable food. The desperation of starvation would drive some Vikings to unthinkable acts that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When all conventional food sources were exhausted and death seemed inevitable, crews would face the ultimate taboo that no warrior wanted to contemplate. Cannibalism became the final, horrific option that separated those who would do anything to survive from those who would rather die with their honor intact. The first discussions about eating human flesh would begin whispered in the darkest corners of the ship, spoken in hushed tones that barely carried over the sound of waves and wind. Vikings would glance nervously at their weakest companions, making calculations that reduced human beings to pounds of meat that could sustain the living for a few more days. These conversations would tear the crew apart psychologically long before any actual cannibalism occurred. Men who had fought side by side, shared their rations, and trusted each other with their lives suddenly became potential meals in each other's eyes. The social bonds that held Viking society together would begin to unravel as survival instinct overwhelmed cultural taboos. When the first crew member died of starvation, the remaining Vikings would face an impossible choice. They could throw the body overboard according to tradition and continue starving, or they could violate every moral principle they held sacred and consume their dead companion. The decision would split crews into factions, with some arguing for survival at any cost, while others insisted that death was preferable to such dishonor. The Vikings who chose cannibalism would discover that eating human flesh provided little relief from their suffering. The meat would be tough and unpalatable, requiring significant energy to digest that their weakened bodies could barely provide. The psychological trauma of consuming their friends would often cause violent illness that negated any nutritional benefit they might have gained. The smell of cooking human flesh would fill the ship with an odor that was unmistakably different from any animal meat. Vikings who participated in these grisly meals would never forget that smell, and it would haunt their dreams long after they returned to civilization. Many would develop permanent aversions to meat of any kind, unable to eat without remembering the taste of their dead companions. Those who refused to participate in cannibalism would watch in horror as their surviving crewmates descended into what they considered a form of madness. The act of eating human flesh would change people in fundamental ways, stripping away their humanity and turning them into something that other Vikings no longer recognized as fully human. The selection of which bodies to consume would create its own set of moral horrors. Would they eat the weakest who died first, or save those bodies and instead kill the strongest to provide more meat? These decisions would have to be made by men who were already half mad from starvation and psychological trauma, leading to choices that would seem incomprehensible to rational minds. Some Vikings would try to establish rules around cannibalism, attempting to maintain some semblance of civilization, even while committing the ultimate taboo. They might decide that only those who died naturally could be consumed, or that certain parts of the body were off limits out of respect for the dead. But these rules would quickly break down as starvation intensified and desperation overwhelmed reason. The preparation of human flesh for consumption would require Vikings to butcher their former companions like animals, using the same knives they had used to gut fish or prepare game on land. The psychological disconnect required to see a friend's body as nothing more than meat would drive many Vikings to complete mental breakdown. Arguments over the distribution of human flesh would lead to violence that made previous fights over regular rations seem trivial. Vikings would literally fight to the death over pieces of their dead companions, abandoning all pretense of brotherhood or loyalty in their desperate hunger. These fights would further reduce the crew, providing more bodies for the survivors to consume in an endless cycle of horror. The guilt associated with cannibalism would be overwhelming for Vikings who survived these experiences. They would return home carrying the knowledge that they had violated the most fundamental taboos of their society, and many would be unable to reintegrate into normal life. Some would become hermits, unable to face the judgment of their communities, while others would develop severe mental illness that would plague them until death. Religious Vikings would believe that cannibalism had damned their souls and prevented them from entering Valhalla, even if they died gloriously in battle later. This spiritual despair would be almost as devastating as the physical trauma, leaving survivors feeling hopeless and disconnected from their gods and their culture. The secret of what happened during these desperate voyages would bind survivors together in a fellowship of shame that would last for the rest of their lives. They would recognize each other by the haunted look in their eyes and the way they recoiled from certain foods or smells. These men would often seek each other out, finding comfort only in the company of others who had shared their ultimate degradation. But even when Vikings managed to avoid the horror of cannibalism, the constant threat of starvation would fundamentally change their relationship with food and eating. They would develop obsessive behaviors around meals, hoarding food even when it was abundant, and eating with a desperate intensity that disturbed those who hadn't shared their experiences. The psychological scars of near starvation would manifest in nightmares that plagued Vikings for decades after their voyages. They would dream of empty food stores, of watching their companions waste away, of making impossible choices between survival and honor. These dreams would be so vivid and traumatic that many Vikings would avoid sleep, leading to chronic exhaustion and mental instability. Some Vikings who survived starvation voyages would develop what we now recognize as eating disorders, binging on enormous quantities of food when it was available, and then feeling overwhelming guilt and shame afterward. They would be unable to trust that their next meal was secure, leading to compulsive hoarding and anxiety around food that would affect their families and communities. The knowledge that they were capable of cannibalism would haunt even Vikings who never actually participated in it. They would know that under the right circumstances, they too could abandon their humanity and consume their friends. This self-knowledge would create a deep sense of shame and self-doubt that would undermine their confidence and their sense of moral superiority. Veterans of starvation voyages would often become obsessed with food preparation and storage, developing elaborate systems for preserving and rationing supplies that seemed excessive to others. They would be unable to waste even the smallest scrap of food, seeing abundance as temporary and always preparing for the next famine. The social dynamics among Vikings who had survived cannibalism voyages would be permanently altered. They would be unable to look at each other without remembering what they had done or considered doing. Friendships would be strained by the knowledge of who had been willing to eat whom, and trust would be difficult to rebuild, even after returning to safety. Communities that welcomed back Vikings from starvation voyages would often sense that something fundamental had changed about these men, even if they never learned the specific details of what had happened. The survivors would carry themselves differently, speak in hushed tones about their experiences, and show reactions to food and eating that marked them as different from other warriors. The ultimate irony of these starvation experiences was that Vikings who survived them often became more effective raiders and warriors. Having faced the absolute worst that life could offer and survived, they would approach battle with a fatalistic courage that made them incredibly dangerous opponents. They had already lost their souls during the voyage, so they had nothing left to fear from death or violence. Yet this effectiveness came at a terrible price that extended far beyond the individual Vikings who had endured starvation. Their families would struggle to understand why their returning warriors were changed, why they couldn't enjoy simple pleasures like family meals or celebrations. The trauma would ripple through Viking communities, affecting wives, children, and friends who had to live with men who had been fundamentally altered by their experiences. The medical understanding of starvation and its effects was virtually non-existent among Vikings, so communities had no framework for helping these traumatized warriors recover from their experiences. They were expected to simply return to normal life as if nothing had happened, but the psychological wounds they carried were often deeper and more lasting than any physical injury they might have sustained in battle. Some Vikings would try to cope with their trauma through alcohol, drinking enormous quantities of ale or mead in an attempt to forget their experiences or numb their emotional pain. This would often lead to violent behavior and social problems that would further isolate them from their communities and families. Others would throw themselves into religious practices with an intensity that bordered on obsession, desperately seeking forgiveness for their actions or trying to prove their worthiness to enter the afterlife despite their violations of sacred taboos. These extreme religious behaviors would often alienate them from more moderate believers and create additional social problems. The children of Vikings who had survived cannibalism voyages would often grow up sensing that something was wrong with their fathers, even if they never learned the specific details of what had happened. These children might develop their own psychological problems, inheriting trauma that had been passed down through family dynamics and unexpressed emotions. Viking society as a whole would be affected by the presence of these traumatized survivors, though the full extent of the impact would never be openly acknowledged. The knowledge that even the bravest warriors could be reduced to cannibalism under the right circumstances would undermine confidence in Viking superiority and moral authority. The stories of starvation and cannibalism would become cautionary tales that were whispered among Vikings planning new voyages, serving as warnings about the importance of proper planning and preparation. However, these stories would also serve to glorify the survivors, portraying them as men who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious, even if victory had come at an unthinkable cost. The legacy of these horrible experiences would influence Viking culture for generations, contributing to their reputation for ruthlessness and their willingness to commit acts that other cultures found incomprehensible. Having crossed the ultimate moral boundary during their voyages, Vikings would find it easier to commit atrocities during raids and conquests. But the starvation and potential cannibalism were just the final stages of a much longer process of psychological breakdown that began long before the food ran out. The mental toll of Viking voyages started from the moment the ship left shore and intensified with each passing day until even the strongest minds began to crack under the relentless pressure. The isolation from land and civilization was perhaps the most underestimated psychological challenge that Vikings faced during their voyages. Modern people who live in connected, populated environments can barely imagine what it feels like to be completely cut off from the rest of humanity, surrounded by endless ocean with no guarantee that land even exists in the direction they're traveling. The vastness of the ocean was psychologically overwhelming for Vikings, who were accustomed to the familiar landscapes of Scandinavia. They would spend days or weeks seeing nothing but water in every direction, with no landmarks, no familiar sights, and no sense of progress toward their destination. This sensory deprivation would begin to affect their mental state within just a few days of leaving shore. The lack of variety in their environment would create a form of psychological torture that was impossible to escape. Every day would bring the same endless expanse of water, the same grey sky, the same monotonous routine of rowing and sailing. Vikings would begin to feel like they were trapped in a nightmare from which they could never wake up. The absence of women and families would create an additional layer of psychological stress that affected every aspect of shipboard life. Vikings were accustomed to the civilizing influence of female companionship and the comfort of family relationships. Trapped aboard ship with only other men, they would become increasingly crude, violent, and unstable as the voyage progressed. The all-male environment would intensify conflicts and eliminate the social moderating influences that normally kept Viking communities relatively peaceful. Without wives, mothers, and daughters to serve as moral anchors, Vikings would descend into increasingly primitive behavior that would shock even their own standards of conduct. Sleep deprivation from the constant watch schedules and harsh conditions would compound all other psychological problems. Vikings would go for days with only scattered hours of rest, never achieving the deep sleep necessary for mental health. This chronic exhaustion would make them prone to hallucinations, paranoia, and violent outbursts that would endanger the entire crew. The hallucinations experienced by sleep-deprived Vikings would often involve seeing land where none existed, hearing voices calling from the water, or perceiving threats that weren't really there. These false perceptions would create panic and confusion among crews who were already struggling to maintain their sanity in impossible conditions. The constant noise aboard the ship would prevent Vikings from ever experiencing the peace and quiet necessary for mental recovery. The creaking of wood, the splash of waves, the sound of wind in the rigging, and the voices of other crew members would create a cacophony that made rest and reflection impossible. This sensory overload would gradually wear down even the strongest minds. The lack of privacy would eliminate any opportunity for Vikings to process their emotions or deal with psychological stress in healthy ways. They would be forced to maintain a facade of strength and confidence even when they were terrified or despairing, because showing weakness could undermine crew morale and their own position within the group hierarchy. The uncertainty about their destination and the success of their mission would create constant anxiety that would build throughout the voyage. Vikings would worry about whether they were sailing in the right direction, whether they would find their target, whether they would survive the return journey, and whether their families were safe at home. These worries would multiply and intensify until they became overwhelming sources of stress. The responsibility that each Viking carried for the survival of his companions would create enormous psychological pressure. They would know that any mistake, any moment of weakness, any failure to perform their duties could result in the death of everyone on board. This responsibility would weigh heavily on men who were already struggling with their own survival. The gradual breakdown of social norms and civilized behavior would be deeply disturbing for Vikings who took pride in their cultural achievements. They would watch themselves and their companions descend into increasingly barbaric behavior, losing the very qualities that distinguished them from the savages they claimed to be superior to. The development of superstitions and irrational beliefs would accelerate as the voyage progressed and psychological stress intensified. Vikings would begin to see omens and portents in every cloud formation, every bird sighting, every unusual wave pattern. These superstitions would provide some comfort, but would also increase anxiety as Vikings constantly searched for signs of their impending doom. The formation of factions and alliances within the crew would create political tensions that would add to the psychological stress of the voyage. Vikings would begin to suspect each other of hoarding food, planning mutinies, or making secret deals that would disadvantage other crew members. These suspicions would create an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that would make cooperation increasingly difficult. The gradual realization that they might not survive the voyage would be one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the experience. Vikings who began their journey confident in their abilities and their luck would slowly come to understand that they were probably going to die far from home, without glory, without proper burial, and without ever seeing their families again. The anticipation of death would become a constant companion that would affect every decision and every interaction. Vikings would begin to say goodbye to each other, share their final thoughts, and make peace with their gods while still fighting desperately for survival. This constant preparation for death would be emotionally exhausting and would drain their will to continue fighting. The breakdown of leadership structures would occur as psychological stress overwhelmed the authority systems that normally governed Viking society. Captains and experienced sailors would lose their ability to command respect as they too succumbed to the mental pressures of the voyage. This leadership vacuum would create chaos and confusion that would make survival even more difficult. The loss of individual identity would be one of the most subtle but profound psychological changes that Vikings would experience. Surrounded constantly by the same people, performing the same tasks, facing the same challenges, they would begin to lose their sense of who they were as individuals. They would become merely interchangeable parts in a survival machine rather than unique human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. The psychological preparation for potential cannibalism would begin long before anyone actually died of starvation. Vikings would find themselves looking at their companions differently, assessing their body weight, their likelihood of survival, their value to the group. These thoughts would horrify them, but would be impossible to suppress as hunger and desperation intensified. The guilt associated with these cannibalistic thoughts would be almost as damaging as the act itself. Vikings would be ashamed of their own minds, disgusted by their ability to consider eating their friends, and terrified of what they were becoming. This self-loathing would add another layer to their psychological suffering. The gradual dehumanization that occurred during these voyages would prepare Vikings for the atrocities they would commit during raids and conquests. Having lost their own humanity during the journey, they would find it easier to deny the humanity of their victims when they finally reached their destination. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this psychological breakdown was that it was largely invisible to the Vikings themselves. They had no understanding of mental health, no vocabulary for describing psychological trauma, and no framework for recognizing when their minds were being damaged by their experiences. They would interpret their symptoms as weakness, cowardice, or divine punishment, rather than as natural responses to impossible circumstances. The stigma associated with mental health problems in Viking society would prevent warriors from seeking help or even acknowledging their symptoms. They would be expected to maintain their strength and composure regardless of their internal struggles, and any sign of psychological weakness would be seen as a character flaw rather than an injury that deserved treatment and compassion. The long-term effects of this psychological trauma would follow Vikings for the rest of their lives, affecting their relationships, their ability to function in society, and their overall mental health. Many would never fully recover from their experiences, living as damaged men who could never quite readjust to normal life on land. The families and communities that welcomed back these psychologically damaged warriors would struggle to understand and cope with the changes in their loved ones. They would see men who looked familiar but acted like strangers, warriors who had lost their joy in life and their ability to form meaningful connections with other people. The cycle of trauma would continue as these damaged Vikings would raise children who would inherit their psychological wounds through family dynamics and learned behaviors. The effects of these horrible voyages would ripple through Viking society for generations, creating a culture that was increasingly hardened, violent, and disconnected from normal human emotions. Yet despite all of these psychological horrors, Vikings continued to undertake these voyages, driven by economic necessity, cultural expectations, and the slim hope that they might be among the lucky few who would return home wealthy and successful. They would convince themselves that they were different, that they were stronger, that they would be able to handle whatever challenges the ocean threw at them. This self-deception was perhaps necessary for Vikings to function at all, because if they truly understood the full extent of the physical and psychological trauma they were about to endure, most would never have left shore in the first place. The romantic myths and heroic stories about Viking voyages served to mask the brutal reality of what these journeys actually entailed. The survivors who did return home would often perpetuate these myths, either because they genuinely believed that their suffering had been worthwhile, or because they couldn't bear to admit the full extent of what they had endured. They would tell stories of glorious adventures and heroic deeds while carefully omitting the details about starvation, disease, psychological breakdown, and cannibalism. But the truth about Viking longship voyages was far more horrific than any Hollywood movie or romantic legend could capture. These were journeys into hell itself, floating nightmares that tested the absolute limits of human endurance, and often found those limits wanting. The men who survived these voyages were forever changed by their experiences, carrying physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The legacy of these brutal voyages would shape Viking culture and European history in ways that are still being felt today. The warriors who emerged from these floating torture chambers would go on to terrorize medieval Europe, bringing with them a level of violence and ruthlessness that was partly forged in the crucible of their ocean ordeals. Understanding the true nature of life aboard Viking longships helps explain why these raiders were so feared and why their impact on history was so profound. They weren't just tough warriors who happened to be good at sailing. They were men who had been broken down and rebuilt by experiences so horrible that they had fundamentally altered their relationship with violence, death, and human suffering. The next time you see a romanticized portrayal of Viking voyages, remember the reality of what these journeys actually entailed. Remember the stench, the starvation, the disease, the psychological breakdown, and the unspeakable acts that desperate men would commit to survive just one more day in their floating prison. These weren't glorious adventures, they were endurance contests against death itself, and the prize for winning wasn't glory or honor. The prize was simply the chance to see another sunrise, and maybe, if they were incredibly lucky, the chance to eventually return home to tell others about the hell they had survived. The psychological scars would manifest in countless ways that Vikings themselves barely understood. Men who had been confident leaders would return home unable to make simple decisions, paralyzed by the memory of choices that had led to their companions' deaths. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving storms that had ended months earlier, feeling phantom waves crashing over them while lying safely in their own beds. Some Vikings would develop an obsessive need to always know where the nearest exit was, never again wanting to feel trapped the way they had been on the Longship. They would refuse to enter small rooms or enclosed spaces, and the sound of creaking wood would send them into violent rages that terrified their families and neighbours. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive during the voyage would become a curse on land. Every unexpected sound would cause them to reach for weapons that weren't there. They would scan crowds constantly for threats, unable to relax even in the safety of their own communities. Sleep would become their enemy because it left them vulnerable to the nightmares that plagued their minds. Many Vikings would turn to alcohol as their only escape from the memories that tormented them. They would drink themselves into oblivion night after night, seeking the temporary peace that only unconsciousness could provide. But even drunk, they would sometimes wake up swinging at invisible enemies or crying out warnings about storms that existed only in their damaged minds. The relationships these men tried to maintain would suffer tremendously under the weight of their psychological trauma. Wives would find themselves married to strangers who looked like their husbands, but acted like wild animals. Children would learn to fear their own fathers, never knowing when a gentle touch might trigger a violent flashback that could leave them injured or dead. Sexual intimacy would become nearly impossible for many Viking veterans. The physical closeness that had once brought comfort would now feel like the cramped conditions of the Longship, triggering panic attacks and violent reactions. Their partners would have to learn to approach them like dangerous animals, moving slowly and speaking softly to avoid setting off explosive reactions. The simple act of eating would be forever changed for these traumatized warriors. They would hoard food obsessively, hiding portions in secret places around their homes because they could never trust that their next meal was guaranteed. Family dinners would become tense affairs where veterans would eat with desperate intensity, as if every meal might be their last. Some Vikings would develop aversions to certain foods that reminded them of their shipboard rations. The smell of dried fish would make them vomit uncontrollably. The sight of salted meat would trigger flashbacks so vivid that they would temporarily lose touch with reality, believing they were back aboard the Longship, fighting for survival. The sound of rain on a roof would send many veterans into panic attacks, reminding them of storms that had nearly killed them. They would barricade themselves in their homes during bad weather, convinced that the wind and rain were going to destroy everything they had managed to rebuild since returning from their voyage. Water itself would become a source of terror for many Vikings who had survived near-drowning experiences during storms. They would refuse to bathe properly, unable to tolerate the feeling of water on their skin, without remembering the sensation of drowning while still breathing. Rivers and lakes that had once provided recreation and sustenance would become obstacles to be avoided at all costs. The veterans would often seek out each other's company, finding solace only among men who had shared similar experiences. They would gather in taverns and drink while sharing stories that no one else could understand or believe. These gatherings would provide temporary relief, but would also reinforce their isolation from the rest of society. Their conversations would be filled with dark humor and casual references to death that would disturb other listeners. They would joke about things that should never be funny, laugh about experiences that should have broken them completely, and speak of human suffering with a detachment that marked them as fundamentally different from other people. The religious beliefs of these traumatized Vikings would often undergo dramatic changes. Some would become fanatically devoted to their gods, convinced that only divine intervention had saved them from certain death. They would make elaborate offerings and perform complex rituals, desperately trying to ensure that they never had to endure such suffering again. Others would lose their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in benevolent gods with the horrors they had experienced and survived. They would become bitter and cynical, mocking the religious practices of their communities and challenging the spiritual beliefs that had once given their lives meaning. The skills that had kept them alive during their voyages would become liabilities in peaceful society. Their ability to function on little sleep would make them insomniacs who paced their homes all night. Their hyper-awareness of potential threats would make them seem paranoid and unstable to neighbors who didn't understand what they had endured. Their capacity for violence, honed by months of fighting for survival, would make them dangerous to be around during moments of stress. A minor argument could escalate into deadly combat because these men had learned that hesitation meant death. They would have to constantly restrain themselves from using the level of force that had been necessary aboard the Longship. The social hierarchy that had governed their shipboard existence would continue to influence their behavior long after returning home. They would struggle with authority figures who hadn't shared their experiences, unable to respect leaders who they knew would have died within days aboard a Longship. This would create conflicts with local authorities and traditional power structures. Some veterans would become obsessed with physical fitness, convinced that their survival had depended entirely on their strength and endurance. They would train compulsively, pushing their bodies to extremes that worried their families and impressed their peers. They would never feel strong enough, never feel prepared enough for the next crisis they were certain was coming. Others would go in the opposite direction, becoming fatalistic and neglecting their health, because they believed their survival had been purely a matter of luck. They would stop caring about their appearance, their hygiene, or their physical condition, convinced that nothing they did could influence their fate. The nightmares that plagued these men would often be so vivid and terrifying that they would prefer to stay awake rather than risk experiencing them. They would develop elaborate bedtime rituals designed to ward off bad dreams, or they would simply refuse to sleep until exhaustion forced unconsciousness upon them. When they did sleep, their partners would learn to sleep lightly, ready to wake them from nightmares that could turn violent without warning. Many Viking wives would bear bruises from being struck by husbands who were fighting dream enemies while still asleep. Some would choose to sleep in separate beds or even separate rooms to protect themselves from their partner's nocturnal battles. The guilt that these veterans carried would be overwhelming and persistent. They would blame themselves for every companion who had died, every decision that had led to suffering, every moment when they had chosen their own survival over someone else's. This guilt would eat at them like a disease, making them believe they didn't deserve the peace and prosperity they had found at home. Some would try to atone for their perceived sins through acts of charity or service to their communities. They would give away their wealth, dedicate themselves to helping others, or undertake dangerous missions that might allow them to die with honor. But nothing could truly cleanse them of the guilt they carried for simply being among the survivors. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive would make normal social interactions nearly impossible. They would constantly scan rooms for exits, assess every person they met as a potential threat, and interpret innocent gestures as signs of impending violence. This would make them seem strange and dangerous to people who didn't understand their behavior. Their families would learn to move slowly around them, speak softly, and avoid sudden movements that might trigger violent reactions. Children would grow up walking on eggshells around fathers who might explode into violence at any moment, creating a new generation of damaged individuals who would carry their own psychological scars into adulthood. The medical understanding of psychological trauma was so primitive that these men would receive no help for their invisible wounds. They would be expected to simply get over their experiences and return to normal life as if nothing had happened. The idea that their minds might need healing just as much as their bodies would be completely foreign to Viking culture. Some would try to self-medicate with various herbs and potions, seeking anything that might provide relief from their constant mental anguish. They would experiment with substances that might numb their pain or help them sleep, often making their problems worse through addiction and dependency. The isolation that these veterans felt would be profound and lasting. They would feel disconnected from their families, their communities, and even their own identities. The men they had been before their voyages would seem like different people entirely, and they would struggle to reconcile their past selves with who they had become. Many would become wanderers, unable to settle in one place for long, because staying still made them feel trapped and vulnerable. They would move from settlement to settlement, never finding the peace they sought, but unable to stop searching for something that might ease their suffering. The impact on their children would be devastating and long-lasting. Kids would grow up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, men who could provide protection and resources but couldn't offer the love and stability that children needed. These children would often develop their own psychological problems, inheriting trauma that they didn't even understand. Some Viking veterans would become obsessed with preparing for disasters that might never come. They would stockpile food and weapons, constantly plan escape routes, and train their families for emergencies that existed mainly in their damaged minds. Their homes would become fortresses designed to protect against threats that were more psychological than real. The sexual dysfunction that many veterans experienced would put enormous strain on their marriages and relationships. The physical intimacy that should have provided comfort and connection would instead trigger memories of the cramped, uncomfortable conditions aboard the Longship. Their partners would feel rejected and confused, unable to understand why their touch caused pain instead of pleasure. Many would develop eating disorders that persisted for years after their return. They might binge eat when food was available, gorging themselves until they were sick because their bodies remembered starvation so vividly. Or they might restrict their eating, rationing their food, even when it was abundant, because they couldn't trust that the supply would continue. The sound of wind would forever remind them of storms that had nearly killed them. They would become agitated during windy weather, pacing their homes and checking and rechecking their preparations for disasters that weren't actually coming. Their families would learn to dread windy days because of the way these sounds affected their traumatized relatives. The veterans who had survived the worst voyages would often be unable to form new friendships or maintain old ones. They would feel that no one could understand what they had been through, and they would be reluctant to burden others with stories that were too horrible to share. This isolation would deepen their depression and make recovery even more difficult. Some would become religious fanatics, convinced that only constant prayer and devotion could protect them from experiencing such horrors again. They would spend hours each day in religious observances, seeking divine protection that they hoped would prevent them from ever having to endure such suffering again. Others would become completely secular, rejecting all religious beliefs because they couldn't reconcile the existence of benevolent gods with the suffering they had witnessed and endured. They would mock religious ceremonies and challenge the faith of others, spreading their own spiritual despair throughout their communities. The physical disabilities that many veterans carried would be constant reminders of their traumatic experiences. Missing fingers from frostbite, scars from infected wounds, and chronic pain from untreated injuries would serve as daily reminders of what they had endured. These physical problems would compound their psychological trauma, making recovery even more difficult. Their relationship with the ocean would be forever changed. Men who had once found joy and freedom in sailing would now see the sea as a malevolent force that had tried to kill them. They would avoid coastal areas, refuse to board any kind of boat, and experience panic attacks at the sight or sound of large bodies of water. The hyper-arousal that had kept them alive during crisis situations would make peaceful environments feel dangerous and wrong. They would be constantly on edge, unable to relax even in the safest circumstances, because their nervous systems had been permanently altered by trauma. This constant state of alertness would be exhausting and would contribute to their overall physical and mental decline. Many veterans would develop obsessive-compulsive behaviors related to their survival experiences. They might check and recheck their supplies, count and recount their possessions, or perform elaborate rituals designed to ensure their safety. These behaviors would provide temporary relief from anxiety, but would also interfere with their ability to function normally. The social skills that these men had possessed before their voyages would be severely damaged by their traumatic experiences. They would struggle with conversation, unable to engage in the light social banter that was expected in their communities. Their interactions would be intense and serious, marked by an urgency that made others uncomfortable. Their sense of time would be distorted by their experiences. Days aboard the Longship had felt like years, while years at home would pass like days. They would have difficulty planning for the future or maintaining long-term goals because their sense of temporal continuity had been shattered by trauma. The nightmares that plagued these veterans would often be so realistic that they would wake up disoriented, unsure of where they were or what year it was. They would sometimes spend several minutes after waking trying to determine whether they were still aboard the Longship or safely at home. This confusion would be terrifying and would make them reluctant to sleep. Some would develop agoraphobia, becoming unable to leave their homes because open spaces reminded them too much of the endless ocean that had nearly killed them. They would feel safe only in enclosed, familiar environments, where they could control all the variables and eliminate potential threats. Others would develop claustrophobia, unable to tolerate enclosed spaces, because they reminded them of the cramped conditions aboard the Longship. They would need to be outside or in large, open rooms to feel comfortable, and they would panic if they felt trapped or confined in any way. The trust issues that developed during their voyages would affect every relationship they tried to maintain. They had learned that anyone could become an enemy when survival was at stake, and they would never again be able to trust others completely. This suspicion would poison their relationships and make genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Their communication skills would be permanently altered by their experiences. They would speak in short, urgent sentences, always getting to the point quickly, because they had learned that wasted words could mean wasted time that might cost lives. This efficiency would make them seem abrupt and rude to people who expected more social pleasantries. Many veterans would become obsessed with weather patterns, constantly monitoring the sky for signs of storms that might threaten their safety. They would develop an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes, but this skill would come at the cost of constant anxiety about meteorological conditions. The simple pleasure of a warm, dry bed would never be taken for granted again by these traumatized warriors. They would appreciate comfort in ways that others couldn't understand, but they would also feel guilty about enjoying luxuries when they remembered companions who had died without ever experiencing such comfort again. Their appetite for risk would be permanently altered by their experiences. Some would become extremely conservative, avoiding any situation that involved uncertainty or danger. Others would become reckless, seeking out dangerous situations because normal life felt boring and meaningless after what they had survived. The bonds they had formed with their surviving shipmates would be stronger than any other relationships in their lives, but these bonds would also be sources of pain because they would constantly remind them of those who hadn't survived. They would gather periodically to honor their dead companions. But these reunions would be bittersweet occasions that reopened old wounds. Their perspective on death would be forever changed by their experiences. They would have a casual familiarity with mortality that would disturb others, but would also give them a fearlessness in battle that would make them legendary warriors. They would face death without flinching, because they had already made peace with it during their voyage. The physical strength that had helped them survive would often decline rapidly after their return home. The constant stress and hypervigilance would take a toll on their bodies, aging them prematurely and leaving them vulnerable to illnesses that their compromised immune systems couldn't fight off effectively. Many would develop chronic pain conditions that doctors couldn't explain or treat. The stress of their traumatic experiences would manifest in physical symptoms that would persist for years, creating a cycle of pain and psychological distress that would be difficult to break. Their sleep patterns would never return to normal. They would wake frequently during the night, checking for threats that weren't there. listening for sounds that might indicate danger. This disrupted sleep would affect their mood, their cognitive function, and their overall health in ways that would compound their other problems. The anniversary dates of their voyages would become annual periods of intense distress. They would relive their experiences with vivid clarity, often becoming temporarily incapacitated by memories that felt as real as the original events. Their families would learn to expect these periodic breakdowns and would try to provide support during these difficult times. Some veterans would become compulsive storytellers, endlessly recounting their experiences to anyone who would listen. They would be driven by a need to make others understand what they had been through, but their stories would often be so intense and disturbing that listeners would avoid them rather than seeking them out. Others would become completely silent about their experiences, refusing to discuss what had happened even with their closest family members. This silence would create barriers in their relationships and would prevent them from processing their trauma in healthy ways. The survival skills they had developed would remain sharp for the rest of their lives, but these skills would often be inappropriate for peaceful civilian life. They would overreact to minor threats, use excessive force in minor conflicts, and maintain a level of vigilance that would exhaust them and worry their loved ones. Their relationship with authority would be forever changed by their experiences of life and death leadership aboard the Longship. They would have little patience for leaders who hadn't proven themselves in extreme circumstances, and they would challenge authority figures who they felt were incompetent or unprepared for real crisis. The camaraderie they had experienced with their fellow survivors would be impossible to replicate in normal social situations. They would constantly search for the intense bonds that had been forged in crisis. But peaceful relationships would feel shallow and meaningless by comparison. Their sense of purpose would be profoundly affected by their survival. Many would struggle to find meaning in normal activities after having their lives stripped down to the most basic elements of survival. They would feel like they were sleepwalking through a life that seemed trivial compared to the intensity of their voyage experience. But perhaps most tragically, these psychological wounds would be invisible to everyone around them, including the veterans themselves. Viking culture had no framework for understanding or treating mental health problems, so these men would suffer in silence, convinced that their problems were signs of weakness rather than natural responses to unnatural experiences. The true cost of Viking voyages wasn't just measured in the lives lost during the journeys themselves. It was also measured in the decades of suffering that followed, in the damaged relationships, the broken families, and the communities that had to absorb and cope with men who had been fundamentally altered by experiences that pushed human endurance beyond any reasonable limit. These psychological casualties would ripple through Viking society for generations, creating a culture that was increasingly hardened to violence and suffering. The normalization of trauma would contribute to the legendary ruthlessness of Viking warriors, but it would also create a society that was less capable of peace, compassion, and genuine human connection. The romantic myths about Viking voyages would persist, because the truth was too horrible for most people to acknowledge or accept. It was easier to believe in stories of glorious adventure than to confront the reality of what these journeys actually did to the human beings who survived them. Yet understanding this psychological dimension of Viking voyages is crucial to understanding both the achievements and the failures of Viking civilization. These weren't just tough guys who happened to be good at sailing and fighting. They were men who had been forged in a crucible of suffering that most modern people couldn't even imagine, let alone survive. The next phase of their ordeal was only just beginning as their battered longship finally approached the coastline of their intended destination. After weeks or months of unrelenting horror at sea, the Vikings faced a new set of challenges that would test everything they had learned about survival, violence, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The sight of land should have brought relief to these traumatized warriors, but instead, It marked the beginning of an entirely new phase of brutality that would push their already damaged minds even further toward complete breakdown. After enduring months of floating hell, Vikings now faced the terrifying prospect of combat. While their bodies were weakened by malnutrition, their minds shattered by psychological trauma, and their equipment corroded by salt water and neglect. The transition from sea to land warfare was jarring and disorienting for Vikings, who had spent so long adapting to the rhythm of shipboard life. Their legs would be unsteady after months of balancing on a constantly moving deck, making them clumsy and vulnerable during the crucial first moments of any raid. Many would stumble and fall when they first stepped onto solid ground, their bodies unable to adjust quickly to surfaces that didn't pitch and roll beneath their feet. The weapons and armor that had been carefully maintained during the voyage would often fail at the worst possible moments. Sword blades that had been repeatedly sharpened and oiled would snap under the stress of combat because the metal had been weakened by constant exposure to salt air. Shields that had seemed sturdy aboard ship would crack and splinter when struck because the wood had been warped by moisture and temperature changes. Chainmail and leather armor that had been meticulously cared for during the voyage would often be stiff and uncomfortable after months of exposure to the elements. The leather would have shrunk or stretched in ways that made it bind and chafe, while metal rings would have corroded enough to weaken the protective mesh. Vikings would discover these equipment failures only when their lives depended on their gear functioning properly. The physical condition of the raiders would be drastically compromised by their ocean ordeal. Men who had been powerful warriors before their voyage would find themselves weakened by malnutrition, dehydration, and the constant stress of survival at sea. Their reflexes would be slower, their strength diminished, and their endurance severely limited compared to their pre-voyage capabilities. The psychological state of these Vikings would make them either exceptionally dangerous or completely ineffective as warriors. Some would channel their trauma into berserker-like fury, becoming unstoppable killing machines who felt no pain and showed no mercy. Others would freeze up completely when faced with combat, their minds overwhelmed by the additional stress of violence after months of psychological torture. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive during storms would make some Vikings incredibly effective in battle, able to anticipate enemy movements and react to threats with supernatural speed. But this same hypervigilance would make others paranoid and jumpy, causing them to attack allies by mistake or waste energy fighting imaginary enemies that existed only in their traumatized minds. Sleep deprivation from months of irregular rest would affect their judgment and reaction time in ways that could prove fatal during combat. Vikings would make tactical errors that they never would have made when well rested, walking into obvious traps or failing to notice enemy movements that should have been apparent to experienced warriors. The social bonds that had been strained to the breaking point during the voyage would often collapse completely during the stress of combat preparation. Vikings who had managed to maintain some semblance of cooperation aboard ship would turn on each other when faced with the prospect of dividing loot or assigning dangerous tasks during raids. Arguments that had been simmering beneath the surface for months would finally explode into violence as Vikings prepared for battle. Men would settle old grudges with axes and swords, sometimes killing more of their own companions than they would enemy defenders. These internal conflicts would weaken raiding parties just when they needed maximum unity and coordination. The leadership structures that had held Viking expeditions together during the voyage would often crumble when faced with the tactical decisions required for successful raids. Captains who had been effective at managing ship operations would prove incompetent at military planning, while warriors who had been good followers at sea would challenge authority when lives were at stake on land. The logistics of moving from sea to land operations would create additional complications that exhausted Vikings before any fighting even began. They would have to unload heavy equipment from their ships, often while under hostile observation or active attack. The process of beaching longships and securing them against theft or destruction would leave raiders vulnerable to enemy countermeasures. Finding fresh water and food immediately upon landing would become a desperate priority that could override tactical considerations. Vikings who had been living on spoiled rations and stagnant water would be driven by basic survival needs that made them reckless and predictable. Enemy defenders who understood this desperation could use it against them, poisoning water sources or setting ambushes near known food supplies. The medical condition of many Vikings would make them liabilities rather than assets during raids. Men suffering from scurvy would be too weak to fight effectively, while those with infected wounds would slow down the entire raiding party. Some would collapse from exhaustion or illness just when their companions needed them most, creating additional problems for already struggling expeditions. The psychological impact of transitioning from victims of circumstance at sea to active aggressors on land would be profound and disorienting. Vikings who had spent months feeling helpless against natural forces would suddenly be expected to take control of situations through violence and intimidation. This psychological shift would be difficult for minds that had been conditioned to accept suffering passively. Some Vikings would overcompensate for their feelings of helplessness by becoming excessively violent and brutal during raids. They would take out months of pent-up frustration and rage on innocent victims who had nothing to do with their suffering. This excessive violence would often be counterproductive, alerting enemy forces and creating unnecessary resistance. Others would be unable to summon the aggression necessary for successful raiding, their spirits broken by months of trauma and suffering. These Vikings would hesitate at crucial moments, show mercy when ruthlessness was required, or simply refuse to participate in the violence that their expeditions depended upon for success. The coordination required for effective raiding would be nearly impossible for groups of traumatized, exhausted, and physically compromised Vikings. Military tactics that required precise timing and flawless execution would fall apart when attempted by men whose minds and bodies had been pushed beyond their limits during the voyage. Communication during raids would be hampered by the psychological damage that many Vikings had sustained. Men who had been reliable messengers and coordinators aboard ship would become confused and unreliable when faced with the chaos of combat. Orders would be misunderstood, signals would be missed, and tactical plans would collapse due to simple communication failures. The element of surprise that Viking raids depended upon would often be lost due to the poor condition of the raiders themselves. Vikings who were supposed to move stealthily would stumble and make noise because of their weakened condition. Those who were meant to remain hidden would give away their positions through coughing fits caused by respiratory infections contracted during the voyage. The intimidation factor that had made Vikings so feared would be diminished when local populations saw the actual condition of the raiders. Instead of the legendary warriors of popular imagination, they would encounter gaunt, sickly men whose equipment was corroded and whose movements were unsteady. This would encourage resistance and make raids more difficult and dangerous. The sexual violence that often accompanied Viking raids would take on an even more disturbing character when perpetrated by men who had been psychologically damaged by their voyages. Vikings who had been deprived of normal human contact for months would commit acts of brutality that went far beyond the usual standards of medieval warfare. The treatment of prisoners and civilians would be affected by the dehumanization that Vikings had experienced during their voyages. Men who had learned to see their own companions as potential sources of meat would have little difficulty viewing enemy populations as less than human. This would lead to atrocities that shocked even the brutal standards of the time. The decision-making processes that governed raids would be compromised by the mental state of the Viking leaders. Captains who had been driven to the edge of sanity by their voyages would make irrational tactical decisions that endangered their entire expeditions. They would take unnecessary risks, ignore obvious dangers, or become paralyzed by indecision at crucial moments. The physical demands of raiding would be overwhelming for Vikings who were already weakened by their sea voyages. Activities that should have been routine, like scaling walls or running in heavy armor, would become nearly impossible for men whose strength had been sapped by months of malnutrition and stress. The psychological preparation for violence that normally preceded Viking raids would be complicated by the trauma that warriors had already endured. The mental rituals and emotional conditioning that helped Vikings commit acts of brutality would be disrupted by intrusive memories and flashbacks from their voyages. Some Vikings would find themselves unable to distinguish between past and present trauma, confusing enemies they were fighting on land with the natural forces that had tormented them at sea. They would attack with a desperation and fury that was driven more by psychological flashbacks than by tactical necessity. The loot and plunder that motivated Viking raids would often prove disappointing to men whose expectations had been inflated by months of suffering and deprivation. The wealth they found would seem inadequate compensation for what they had endured, leading to frustration and additional violence as they searched for prizes worthy of their sacrifice. The division of spoils would create new conflicts among Vikings who had already been pushed to their psychological limits. Men who had shared every hardship of the voyage would turn violent when faced with the prospect of unequal rewards. These disputes would sometimes result in more casualties than the actual raids had produced. The capture and management of slaves would be complicated by the mental state of the Vikings responsible for guarding them. Traumatized warriors would either be excessively brutal toward their captives or dangerously negligent in their supervision. Both extremes would create problems that could jeopardize the success of entire expeditions. The logistics of loading plundered goods onto longships would be hampered by the poor physical condition of the raiders. Vikings who could barely manage their own equipment would struggle to transport heavy loot back to their vessels. This would slow down raids and increase the risk of being caught by pursuing enemy forces. The return voyage would present additional psychological challenges for Vikings who were now burdened with the guilt of their actions on land, as well as the trauma of their original journey. The combination of pre-existing mental damage and fresh psychological wounds from violence would create a toxic mixture that would be almost impossible for their minds to process. Some Vikings would become obsessed with the violence they had committed, replaying scenes of brutality over and over in their minds until they lost touch with reality. Others would try to suppress these memories, adding another layer of psychological damage to minds that were already severely compromised. The religious implications of their actions would weigh heavily on Vikings who had turned to faith as a coping mechanism during their voyages. Men who had prayed desperately for survival at sea would now have to reconcile their gratitude toward their gods with the atrocities they had committed in those gods' names. The contrast between their helplessness at sea and their brutality on land would create cognitive dissonance that many Vikings would be unable to resolve. They would struggle to understand how they could be victims and perpetrators simultaneously, heroes and monsters depending on the circumstances they faced. The social dynamics within raiding parties would be permanently altered by the shared experience of extreme violence following extreme suffering. Vikings would be bonded together by their participation in acts that would be incomprehensible to those who hadn't shared their experiences, but these bonds would be forged in darkness and would carry psychological costs that would last for generations. The reputation that these damaged warriors would build through their raids would be based as much on their unpredictability and psychological instability as on their military prowess. Enemy populations would fear Vikings not just because they were skilled fighters, but because they seemed to operate according to rules and motivations that normal people couldn't understand or predict. The cultural impact of these traumatized raiders would extend far beyond their immediate military actions. They would bring back to their home communities a level of violence and psychological damage that would influence Viking society for centuries. The normalization of extreme trauma would become part of Viking culture, affecting how they raised their children, conducted their relationships, and viewed the world around them. The economic success of these raids would often be overshadowed by the human cost of achieving it. Vikings would return home with wealth and slaves, but they would also bring back psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The price of their success would be paid not just by their victims, but by the raiders themselves, and by the families and communities that had to live with the consequences of their trauma. The strategic implications of fielding armies of traumatized warriors would become apparent as Viking raids became more frequent and widespread. These damaged men would be capable of extreme violence, but would also be unreliable and difficult to control. Military leaders would have to develop new tactics and strategies to account for the psychological instability of their forces. The technological innovations that Vikings developed for raiding would often be driven by the limitations imposed by their psychological and physical condition. Equipment would be designed to compensate for weakened reflexes, compromised judgment, and reduced coordination. Weapons would be simplified, and tactics would be adapted to work with damaged rather than optimal warriors. The intelligence gathering that was crucial for successful raids would be complicated by the mental state of Viking scouts and spies. Men who had been psychologically damaged by their voyages would be unreliable observers whose reports might be coloured by paranoia, hallucinations, or simple confusion. This would lead to tactical errors and strategic miscalculations that could doom entire expeditions. The seasonal timing of Viking raids would be influenced by the psychological cycles that governed the behaviour of traumatized warriors. Certain times of year would trigger massive flashbacks and psychological breakdowns that would make military operations impossible. Viking leaders would have to plan their campaigns around the mental health limitations of their forces. The training and preparation of new warriors would be complicated by the example set by traumatized veterans. Young Vikings would learn fighting techniques from men whose methods had been shaped by extreme trauma rather than traditional military doctrine. This would create a new generation of warriors whose approach to combat was fundamentally different from their predecessors. The diplomatic relationships that Vikings maintained with other cultures would be affected by the reputation they gained through the actions of their traumatized raiders. Other peoples would view Vikings as fundamentally different and dangerous, not just because of their military capabilities, but because of their apparent psychological instability and unpredictability. The internal politics of Viking communities would be shaped by the presence of large numbers of traumatized veterans who had difficulty readjusting to peaceful civilian life. These men would form a distinct class within Viking society, bound together by shared experiences that set them apart from those who had never endured such extreme hardships. The religious and cultural practices of Viking society would evolve to accommodate the psychological needs of their traumatized warriors. New rituals would be developed to help veterans cope with their experiences, while existing traditions would be modified to provide meaning and structure for men whose worldviews had been fundamentally altered by trauma. The artistic and literary expressions of Viking culture would be influenced by the experiences of their traumatized raiders. Stories, songs, and visual arts would reflect the psychological reality of what these voyages actually entailed, though often in coded or symbolic forms that made the truth more palatable to audiences who hadn't lived through such experiences. The legal systems that governed Viking communities would have to adapt to deal with the special problems created by large populations of traumatized veterans. New laws and procedures would be needed to handle the violence, unpredictability, and social dysfunction that these men brought back with them from their voyages. The economic structures of Viking society would be shaped by the wealth generated through raids conducted by traumatized warriors, but also by the costs of supporting and managing populations of damaged veterans. Communities would have to balance the profits of successful raids against the ongoing expenses of dealing with their psychological casualties. The military innovations that Vikings developed would spread to other cultures through contact and conflict, but so would awareness of the psychological costs of their methods. Other peoples would learn both the tactical advantages of Viking techniques and the human price that was paid to achieve them. The legacy of these traumatized Viking raiders would extend far beyond the medieval period, influencing European culture and psychology in ways that are still being discovered today. The normalization of extreme trauma and violence would become part of the cultural DNA of societies that were shaped by Viking influence. The romantic myths that would eventually develop around Viking culture would serve partly as a psychological defense mechanism, allowing later generations to admire the achievements of their ancestors, while avoiding confrontation with the full reality of what those achievements had cost in human terms. The historical records that documented Viking raids would often focus on the military and political outcomes while ignoring or minimizing the psychological dimensions of these conflicts. This selective recording would contribute to misunderstandings about the true nature of Viking warfare that would persist for centuries. The archaeological evidence left behind by Viking raiders would tell a story of violence and destruction, but it would be unable to capture the psychological reality of what these men had endured and inflicted. The material remains would provide only hints about the human cost of these expeditions. The genetic legacy of Viking raids would include not just the obvious effects of conquest and settlement, but also the more subtle impacts of trauma on reproductive behavior, child-rearing practices, and family structures. The psychological damage inflicted and sustained during these voyages would influence human development in ways that would echo through generations. The medical understanding of trauma and its effects would remain primitive for centuries after the Viking Age, meaning that the psychological casualties of these voyages would never receive proper treatment or recognition. Their suffering would be invisible to history, acknowledged only in scattered references and oblique allusions that hint at truths too horrible to state directly. The social evolution of European civilization would be influenced by the presence of these traumatized populations, though the connections would be subtle and difficult to trace. The capacity for organized violence that characterized medieval Europe would be partly a product of the psychological conditioning that Viking-style warfare created in its practitioners. The technological and tactical innovations that emerged from Viking warfare would be adopted by other military organizations, but often without full understanding of the psychological costs that had made them necessary. The techniques would spread, while the trauma that had inspired them remained hidden and unexamined. The cultural values that Viking society developed around concepts like honor, courage, and loyalty would be shaped by the need to provide psychological frameworks that could help traumatized warriors find meaning in their experiences. These values would persist long after the original context that had created them was forgotten. The religious and philosophical traditions that emerged from Viking culture would reflect the attempt to make sense of extreme suffering and violence, though often in symbolic rather than literal terms. The mythologies and belief systems would encode psychological truths about trauma and survival that would resonate with later generations who faced their own challenges. The storytelling traditions that preserved Viking history would serve multiple functions, including the psychological need to process collective trauma through narrative. The sagas and legends would provide frameworks for understanding experiences that were otherwise too overwhelming to confront directly. The artistic achievements of Viking culture would often be motivated by the need to create beauty and meaning in the face of overwhelming ugliness and chaos. The decorative arts, poetry, and music would serve as psychological antidotes to the trauma that was central to Viking experience. The exploration and settlement patterns of Viking expansion would be influenced by the psychological needs of traumatized populations, seeking new environments where they might escape the memories and associations that haunted them in their original homes. Migration would serve therapeutic as well as economic functions. The trade relationships that Vikings established would be affected by the reputation they gained through their traumatized raiders, but also by the psychological needs of communities trying to integrate populations of damaged veterans. Commerce would become a way of channeling aggressive impulses into productive rather than destructive activities. The linguistic evolution of Norse languages would be influenced by the need to develop vocabulary and expressions that could describe and process traumatic experiences. New words and concepts would emerge to help people communicate about psychological states that had no precedent in earlier cultural contexts. The educational systems that Viking communities developed would have to address the challenge of passing on practical knowledge while also helping young people understand and cope with the psychological realities of their culture. Teaching would become as much about psychological preparation as about technical skills. The family structures that evolved in Viking society would be shaped by the presence of traumatized fathers and the psychological needs of children who were growing up in communities marked by collective trauma. Child-rearing practices would adapt to help young people develop resilience in the face of psychological challenges. The gender roles that characterized Viking society would be influenced by the psychological damage that military service inflicted on men, creating opportunities and necessities for women to take on responsibilities that might otherwise have been reserved for male warriors. The trauma would reshape social structures in unexpected ways. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking life would be affected by the psychological cycles of traumatized veterans, whose symptoms might be triggered by anniversaries, weather patterns, or other environmental cues that reminded them of their traumatic experiences. Community life would have to accommodate these psychological vulnerabilities. The agricultural and pastoral practices that sustained Viking communities would be influenced by the need to provide meaningful work for traumatized veterans who might be unsuited for military service, but who still needed productive roles within their society. Farming would become a form of therapy as well as economic necessity. The craftsmanship traditions that Viking culture is famous for would be partly motivated by the psychological need of traumatized individuals to create something beautiful and lasting as an antidote to their experiences of destruction and chaos. Artistic creation would serve healing functions that went beyond mere aesthetic expression. The funeral and burial practices that Vikings developed would reflect their intimate familiarity with death and their need to process the psychological impact of losing so many companions to violence and hardship. Ritual would provide frameworks for grief that acknowledge the complex emotions surrounding traumatic loss. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood in Viking society would have to prepare young people not just for the practical challenges of adult life, but for the psychological realities of a culture shaped by collective trauma. Initiation would include psychological as well as physical preparation. The healing traditions that Viking communities maintained would gradually evolve to address psychological as well as physical ailments, though the understanding would remain primitive and the treatments largely ineffective. The recognition that trauma could cause lasting damage would slowly emerge through trial and error. The leadership structures that governed Viking society would be influenced by the need to manage populations of traumatized veterans whose loyalty and reliability could not be taken for granted. Political systems would have to account for the psychological volatility of their military classes. The justice systems that Viking communities employed would have to deal with the special problems created by traumatized individuals whose behavior might be driven by psychological damage rather than simple criminality. Legal frameworks would evolve to distinguish between different types of antisocial behavior. The architectural traditions that Vikings developed would reflect both practical and psychological needs, creating spaces that could provide security and comfort for populations that had been psychologically damaged by their experiences. Building design would serve therapeutic as well as functional purposes. The food culture that characterized Viking society would be influenced by the eating disorders and nutritional anxieties that many veterans brought back from their voyages. Feast traditions and food preparation practices would evolve to address psychological as well as physical hunger. The textile and clothing traditions would reflect the need to provide comfort and protection for bodies and minds that had been damaged by extreme experiences. Garment design would consider psychological as well as physical comfort, creating clothing that could help traumatized individuals feel safe and secure. The musical traditions that Viking communities maintained would serve psychological functions, providing emotional outlets and communal bonding experiences that could help traumatized individuals process their experiences and reconnect with their communities. Music would become a form of group therapy. The dance and movement traditions would provide physical outlets for psychological tension and would help traumatized individuals reconnect with their bodies in positive ways. Physical expression would serve healing functions that complemented other forms of psychological support. The storytelling and oral history traditions would serve crucial psychological functions, providing frameworks for understanding and processing traumatic experiences while also preserving cultural knowledge and values. Narrative would become a primary tool for psychological healing and cultural continuity. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire cycle was how it would perpetuate itself across generations, creating a culture that was increasingly hardened to violence and suffering while losing touch with the psychological costs of its military traditions. The normalization of trauma would become so complete that Viking society would eventually lose the ability to distinguish between necessary hardship and unnecessary brutality. The children who grew up in communities shaped by collective trauma would internalize these psychological patterns as normal, carrying forward the damage in ways that would affect their own relationships, their parenting practices, and their approach to conflict resolution. The cycle would continue generation after generation, creating a culture that was increasingly disconnected from healthy emotional expression and interpersonal connection. The romantic myths that would eventually surround Viking culture would serve as a psychological defense mechanism, allowing later generations to admire the achievements of their ancestors while avoiding confrontation with the full reality of what those achievements had cost in human terms. The legends would preserve the glory while editing out the horror, creating a sanitized version of history that bore little resemblance to the actual experiences of the men who had lived through these ordeals. Yet understanding the true psychological reality of Viking voyages is essential for comprehending not just medieval history, but the broader patterns of how human societies cope with collective trauma and the ways that extreme experiences shape cultural development. The Vikings were not uniquely brutal or psychologically damaged, but they provide a clear example of how extreme circumstances can transform individuals and entire cultures in ways that echo through centuries. The lessons of Viking psychological trauma remain relevant today as modern societies grapple with the long-term effects of warfare, displacement, and other extreme experiences on both individuals and communities. The patterns of trauma, adaptation, and cultural transmission that characterize Viking society can be seen in many contemporary contexts, reminding us that the human cost of violence extends far beyond immediate casualties. The true legacy of Viking voyages lies not just in their military conquests or their contributions to exploration and trade, but in their demonstration of both human resilience and human fragility in the face of extreme adversity. They show us what people are capable of enduring, but also what that endurance costs and how those costs are transmitted across generations and cultures. The next phase of their ordeal would test these already shattered men in ways that would make their previous suffering seem almost bearable by comparison, as they faced the prospect of returning home to communities and families who could never truly understand what they had become during their months in floating hell.